Four writers, one death. Four completely different stories. Not slightly different, not off by a word or two. The last words are different. The tone is different. What Jesus says or doesn't say is different. If you sit down and read all four accounts back to back, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, you will notice the gaps. And eventually, you'll land on the question that most people are afraid to ask out loud. Did someone get it wrong? We begin with Mark. Mark was first. The others read him. Some of them copied him almost word for word, and then changed the ending. Picture someone in Rome around 65 AD. Nero is in power. Following Jesus could cost you your job, maybe your family, maybe your life. Mark is writing for that person, not a theology student, not someone with time to read footnotes, someone who needs to know if Jesus understands what it feels like to watch everything fall apart. Mark's Jesus on the cross says exactly one thing. My God, why have you forsaken me? That's it. That is the only sentence Mark records from the cross. No words to his mother, no prayer for his killers, no comfort to anyone dying beside him. Just that cry. And Mark even writes it in Aramaic first, then translates it, as if he wants you to hear it the way it came out of his mouth. Raw, unfiltered, in the original language of the man screaming it. Mark was written close enough to the events that eyewitnesses were still alive. People who could have said, that's not how it happened. Mark preserves this cry because it happened. And here's what most people miss. That line, my God, why have you forsaken me, is the opening line of Psalm 22, a psalm that begins in total darkness and ends in vindication. Mark's audience would have known it by heart. The cry wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a song they already knew. Mark doesn't explain that. He doesn't hold your hand through it. He trusts you to feel the darkness before you understand the light. But notice what Mark leaves out. There's no earthquake, no raised dead, no words of forgiveness or peace, just the cry and the silence after it. Matthew read Mark's version, and then he added something so strange, so unexplained, that scholars have been arguing about it ever since. Matthew keeps the cry, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's still there. Matthew is drawing from Mark, and he doesn't remove it. But Matthew is writing for a completely different room. His audience grew up with the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms. These are Jewish Christians who have a burning question that Mark never fully answers. How can a man who died on a Roman cross be the Messiah? How does this end fit the story they were raised on? Matthew builds a case, methodically, like a lawyer presenting evidence to a jury that already knows the law. They just need to see how it applies. The soldiers dividing his clothes, Psalm 22. The crowd shaking their heads, mocking him, Psalm 22. The offer of sour wine, Psalm 69. Every detail Matthew records has a thread running back into the Hebrew Scriptures. He is saying one piece of evidence at a time. This was not an accident. This was the destination the whole story was moving toward. Full stop. And then Matthew does something no other gospel does. When Jesus dies, the earth shakes. Rocks split open. The temple curtain tears from top to bottom. And then, this is the part that stops most careful readers cold. Tombs open, and people who had died walk out, and they go into Jerusalem. That detail appears only in Matthew. Nowhere else in any gospel, any letter, any early Christian text not a footnote, not a passing reference. Matthew places it right at the center of the crucifixion scene, and then says almost nothing more about it. No names, no conversations, no explanation of where they went. Just the dead walked into the city. Sit with how strange that is for a moment. Matthew doesn't offer a tidy frame for it. He records it the way you record something that actually left you speechless, without editorial commentary, because the event itself was already louder than any words he could wrap around it. The old order is cracking open. The curtain dividing ordinary people from the presence of God is torn. The dead are moving. In Matthew, this death isn't the end of something. It's the hinge point of history. And the Roman soldier standing at the foot of the cross, the representative of the empire that just killed him, looks up and says, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Even he saw it. The soldier saw it. The dead walked. And the cry, Mark's raw, unfiltered cry, was still at the center of it all. Luke read every word of that, and then he deleted it. Luke is a doctor, a Gentile, someone who interviewed eyewitnesses and told them openly in his own opening lines that he was organizing everything carefully in sequence. Luke's Jesus on the cross does not cry out in desolation. That line, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" is not in Luke, not removed in passing, completely absent. Instead, Luke gives us 3 moments no other gospel records. The first, as the soldiers are nailing him to the cross, while it is still happening, Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Forgiveness extended before anyone asked for it, in the middle of the act, not after. The second, one of the criminals dying beside him, turns and asks to be remembered. In Matthew and Mark, both criminals mock Jesus. In Luke, one of them turns, and Jesus answers him directly. "Today you will be with me in paradise." A personal promise to a man with nothing left to offer in his final hours. The third, when Jesus dies, in Luke, his last words are not a cry. They are, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Quiet, trusting, almost peaceful. Why does Luke tell it this way? He is writing for Theophilus, a Gentile, possibly a Roman official, and for a Greek world that had a deep tradition of the noble death. The philosopher who faces the end without flinching, who maintains dignity and virtue even while dying. Luke gives them that, but with something no philosopher ever had. His Jesus doesn't die with peace because he is above the pain. He dies in the pain and keeps reaching outward through it, to his killers, to a criminal, to God. There's something worth pausing on here. The last person Jesus saves before he dies has nothing. No record, no good works, no time to do anything about any of it. He just says, "Remember me." And that was enough. Here's something most people never notice. In Matthew and Mark, darkness covers the land while Jesus is still on the cross, and he dies inside it. In Luke, the darkness lifts before he dies. The sun returns, and then he goes. Luke is the only gospel where Jesus does not die in darkness. That inversion is quiet, and it changes the entire atmosphere of the scene. But Luke's account, centered entirely on grace and compassion, leaves a question unresolved. If this is a story about a God who forgives and comforts, what does it mean that he died at all? What was actually accomplished? 3 accounts in, and no one has answered the one question underneath all of them. What did this death actually do? John waited decades before he wrote his. He had one answer, and it changes everything. John is the last of the four Gospels, written later, by someone or a community around someone who had lived with the story for decades. And when John gets to the cross, the difference is impossible to miss. John's Jesus is not in crisis. There is no cry of desolation, no earthquake, no darkness over the land. John's Jesus looks down from the cross and calmly arranges his mother's future, giving her to the beloved disciple as a son. A quiet act of love, practical, personal, in the middle of dying. Then John's Jesus says, "I thirst."
And John stops to tell us this was to fulfill Scripture, not weakness, completion. And then, when everything is in place, Jesus says his final words. Not a prayer, not a cry, a declaration. It is finished. In Greek, one word, tetelestai. That word appeared on paid receipts in the ancient world, stamped across a debt. Done. Closed. Paid in full. That's the argument. John's Jesus doesn't die from the crucifixion. He finishes something through it. The early Christian world that John was writing into had begun asking hard questions. Was Jesus fully divine? Was the suffering real or just an appearance? Was any of this actually happening to a real body? John's answer is yes. The suffering is real. He bleeds, he thirsts, he dies. But it is also God in that body, completing something that was always the plan. Not a victim on a cross, a king stepping down from a throne he chose and returning to it. 4 Gospels, 4 crucifixions. Mark gives you the cry, so that when God feels absent, you know you are not the first person to feel that way from inside a real human body. Matthew gives you the fulfillment, so you know this wasn't an interruption of the story. It was the destination. The whole story was always moving toward. Luke gives you the grace, so you know that mercy wasn't rationed out to people who had earned it. It was extended in the middle of the worst moment to people who had nothing left. John gives you the completion, so you know that what looks like defeat is the moment everything was paid in full. Now, did these writers contradict each other? Honest answer. In small details, there are variations. Sequence, exact wording, who was present, what was said. Ancient writers working from memory, oral tradition, and a clear theological purpose were not producing court transcripts. They were telling the truth about a person, and 4 people who truly knew the same person will always describe them differently. Not because one of them is lying, because truth about a person is larger than any single angle on them. Think about someone you love, someone you've lost, or someone you'd grieve if you lost them. If 4 people who knew them each described the most important moment of their life, they would remember different things. They would emphasize different details. The core would be the same, but each account would be theirs. That's what you have here. Not 4 versions competing for accuracy. 4 witnesses, each holding a lamp, each lighting a different corner of the same room. If the differences in the Gospels have ever felt like a problem to you, something to explain away, or something that quietly unsettled your faith, sit with what you've just seen. The differences are not a weakness in the story. They are evidence that real people with real perspectives encountered something so large that no single account could hold it. Mark wrote for people who were suffering and needed to know God was not absent in the silence. Matthew wrote for people who had been waiting and needed to see how the whole story fit together. Luke wrote for people who needed grace they had not earned and had no time left to earn. John wrote for people who needed to know that something was genuinely finished, that the debt was real, and it was paid. Which one of those is you today? Maybe it changes week to week. maybe all 4 will land at once. The question isn't whether someone got it wrong. The question is, why 4 people who witnessed the same death felt compelled to tell it so differently? And why 2,000 years later, each version still finds exactly the person it was written for? That's exactly why there are 4. Come back next week. We'll open the next page together. FD_005_A_4 versions. Jesus death _script_v2.md.